AI is not new. Predictive analytics, linear algebra, deep learning, which is just a shit ton of storage, is also not new. You still have to review the code. He doesn't review that code. He's either not competent or worse, he's negligent because he's the one who generated it. Is there a need? Oh yeah, there's still a need, but it's the need for the really, really high-end folks. Human beings have now created another even species. All those electricians, all those plumbers, boy, they just became super valuable. Plumbers have saved more lives over the centuries than any medical doctor ever has. Because here's the one thing that the banks do offer. Security, okay, whether that's real or it's a perception.
Do you think that there are extraterrestrial activities?
I think it's pretty safe to say that we got a whole bunch of friends out there, but it's also pretty safe to say we should behave ourselves.
Thank you everyone for your support, and just like that, we've hit 10 episodes. Last week was an incredibly heavy one with everything that unfolded in Nepal and also the tragic murder of Charlie Kirk here in the US. My thoughts and prayers go out to all the families out in Nepal. That's where my heart lies, and also to Charlie's family here in the US. For episode 10, I had the privilege of traveling to Austin to sit down with Michael Marcotte, co-founder of National Cybersecurity Center and former chairman of its Rapid Response Center. Michael also served as Global CIO at Echostar, the parent company of Hughes, SlingTV and Dish. With a background in aerospace, aeronautical, and astronautical engineering, he's not only a distinguished technologist, but also a pilot and aerobatics aviator. He's also a two-time winner of NASA Award for Engineering Excellence and has won the US Air Force Award for Aeronautical Engineering. In this episode, we dive into some of the most pressing challenges facing today's world, from cybersecurity threats to quantum computing, TikTok, data privacy, and even free speech. While these may sound like highly technical topics, Michael breaks them down in the simplest and most relatable way, making the conversation easy to follow for everyone. I truly enjoyed this discussion and hope you find it as insightful and engaging. And thanks for listening.
Michael, thank you so much for getting this done.
You bet.
How are you?
I'm well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So you're the current chairman of and CEO of, how do you say your organization name?
Archius. It's Latin.
Latin. Okay. And then you were formerly you were at you're the CIO or Chief Digital Officer and President of the Cloud Services at Hughes, which is a subsidiary of Echostar, right?
Echostar.
Echostar. Yeah, and that's a parent company of Dish Network, SlingTV, and you're a rocket engineer, you're a quantum physicist. So when I saw your portfolio and I started doing that, I was like, okay, I need to have a conversation with Michael, because obviously you're also one of the leading cybersecurity experts in the world, right? So right off the bat, what are the major issues that we have today in cybersecurity world?
First of all, thank you for the introduction. My least favorite topic is myself, so appreciate it. Boy, that's a lot to unpack. You know, and as we talked about before, I'm actually a big fan of rabbit holes. You know, they get a bad rap. Rabbit holes are kind of interesting because as you kind of go down the rabbit hole, people with honed senses of pattern recognition start figuring out that, hey, something that looks abstract over here might relate to this, might relate to this, might relate to this. So your question, Sanjeev, was what are the biggest issues that are facing cybersecurity right now? I think the single largest issue is a very human one. And that is that as we've layered levels of complexity or levels of abstraction on to what I would loosely just call the information technology stack, right? How things were built over the last 20, 30, 40 years. The number of people who actually understand those layers of abstraction has gotten to an infinitesimally low number, easy for me to say, a low number of individuals. And let me explain why. So you could have an IQ, extremely high IQ, in excess of 125, 135. If you don't have enough time on the planet and haven't been doing this stuff since a very, very young age, and there's kind of a Goldilocks age in here. It's probably with, it turns out some of the smartest people around are these, what I call zillennials. All right. We way underestimated how smart they are. All right. Younger millennials and Gen Zers are extremely smart, and they have the ability to catch up quick on a lot of things. But there's a certain population of Gen Xers. All right. And it's a very, very small group, because we have to remember that Generation X only really represents somewhere in the neighborhood of 19% of the population. All right. The number of those people who grew up with technology and were also techie kids is extremely small. Now, this relates to your question about one of the biggest challenges in cybersecurity right now. So if you were not in that age group and you weren't a techie kid, you're probably not going to understand all the layers of abstraction that exist in these systems. So I recognize we've got a wide audience here, so I'm going to try and not get too engineering techie on this. We have to go back to the late 70s and early 1980s. Right? There were two major hardware platforms. Let's just say in or about that 1983 area. Right? One are CISC-based processing units and one are RISC-based processing units. Right? Each one of those CPUs and the associated chips around them that all have some sort of embedded software in them all start with a different form of machine language. That machine language then, and I'm oversimplifying this for the sake of brevity here, right, is then going to communicate with C, is then going to communicate with C++, object-oriented C, Java, Ruby on Rails, and so forth. So if you don't have enough time on the planet to understand these levels of abstraction, and again, it has nothing to do with fluid intelligence. It literally is, there's only so much time in the day, right, where you can assimilate all this information. And something lower in that stack is either penetrated from a cybersecurity standpoint or compromised, or it even breaks. Right, lower in that stack, and you're a Ruby on Rails expert, or you're a Fluid expert, or you're a Java expert, and you don't understand all the way down to the machine code how it works. We've got an extreme vulnerability here. So there are those of us who are very, very concerned about simply the finite number of people that exist on the planet right now who actually understand all this. Additionally, I would point out, in cybersecurity, it's not just a matter of understanding how the software functions. You have to understand with a great degree of breadth and depth how the networks operate and also systems administration. So you have to have breadth and depth in systems administration, software development, the layers of abstraction, how the networks function. And you as an electrical engineer are going to understand this too, how even things like the power grid works in electrical engineering function. Now, you can separate that out into different swim lanes and put together a collection of people who do understand it, but then they have to cross-pollinate. So this is a complex issue.
Yeah, there's a lot of, every single year you have these major hacks of some sort. Like it just comes about. There's always, something new. I want to talk about two ones in particular, which, I just wanted to get your attention towards it. So we had the SolarWinds hack and we had the Bangladesh bank hack, which resulted in loss of a lot of dollars, a lot of money. So it seems like, Michael, the human element always makes it a case for stuff like this. So SolarWinds hack, if you dive into it, and now I do want to dive into this a little bit because all it came about was through a very poorly managed password, basically, right? Someone had set up their server or the update a password as SolarWinds123, and that literally gave it a gateway for the malware to exist. Now, a little bit of a question for you on there is, the malware was able to stay stagnant, or like just basically it was there in the system for 13 months.
Yes.
Not a day, not 2 days, 13 months.
Right.
Can we talk about that a little bit?
Sure. It's generally referred to as sleeper code when it's placed in there, right? So if you're putting the software into what is known as a dynamic link library, which is what was done in the case of the SolarWinds attack, and you're doing a code review on it, and it may be missed in that process. And this is not pick on SolarWinds Day at all. All right. Something was missed in the process that existed there that allowed that sleeper code to exist. But once it's been stagnant for a period of time, there's no reason in other layers, I'm going to go back to this term again, other layers of abstraction have been put on top of it. You're likely not going to go review those previous releases of software to see that it was there. So the way that it did call outs subsequently to that in creating a backdoor, frankly, was genius based on, the state-based actor that put it in using a hacking organization as a front. It's a classic smoke and mirrors routine that a lot of complex organizations will use to kind of misdirect where things are going. But the sleeper code in there then created effectively what's been referred to, and this is an acquaintance of mine from the United States Air Force who actually coined the term, an advanced persistent threat. That then can use call-outs and have all sorts of fun with what those systems are doing. And by the way, I'm also mindful of the fact that sometimes it's back to the basics. You pointed out the fact that a weak password can compromise a lot. So we enter into quantum computing. There's a whole other conversation there about how much passwords even matter anymore. But right now, as we're still in a binary computing age, passwords matter.
And we'll come to that. Quantum computing, there's an entire set of questions for you. But going back to the second heist, which was the Bangladesh bank heist, was done through the Swift code system.
Yeah.
And also the human element to that was, you had these requests that were made, which is a large chunk of money. And for me, I just thought that no one really cared to just take a look at it twice or thrice. And the only thing that really caught someone's attention was because the bank that everything was going to get deposited into Philippines, the street address coincided with Iranian vessel that had been basically labeled as a potential. It is the system had flagged it because the name coincided with the vessel's name, and that's how they were able to stop it. But still, the element of the human element is always going to exist there, because the inception of the malware into the system was through someone just basically sending in a very basic email with a resume at the bank, and someone opened that, and basically everything flowed into the network. And the human element. How do we counter that,
Sure.
Michael?
Well, part of it is back to the basics. Yeah. We have to train our folks, whether it's a phishing attack. There's a technical element to this, and then there's a human element to this. Right? And we can kind of trace down both of those swim lanes. So let me back up a little bit. Banks have an interesting conundrum that they're facing right now. Most of these systems were developed in the late 1970s, maybe even early to mid 1970s. The banking systems were largely written in languages called COBOL or DIBOL, which are largely forgotten at this point. The databases were 3GL databases, so they weren't even relational at the time. They were ISAMs. All right, the number of people who understand that technology and then the overlays, and I referenced this earlier, those layers of abstraction, is a teeny, teeny, tiny number. So there's a technical conundrum that exists. But sometimes we forget the human element, Sanjeev, which is super important. Okay. Hey, are we looking at something? Does this make sense? You and I know each other. We've developed some familiarity with each other at this juncture. If I get a note out of the blue, and this somewhat relates to the Bangladesh breach, but also relates to just kind of how we live our day-to-day lives. If I get a note from you, even if it's across a secure communicator, and something about that doesn't look right, it's probably a good idea to pick up the telephone and call you. Right? Pick up my secure voice connection, to be clear, and call you and say, hey, do you remember that conversation that we had, outside of this studio? What did you tell me about this? Right? Now, that's a fairly sophisticated, but also fairly simple way of determining, this is actually you, which avoids, something we're going to talk about later, which is more of a deep fake. Mm-hmm. So, in a more simplistic term, and you already pointed it out, this is pattern recognition. Wait a minute, this doesn't quite look right. All right. Here is a Swift transaction. All right. It's going to an address that doesn't quite look right. By the way, it shouldn't matter what the number is. It shouldn't matter if it's $1 million or $20, right? Something isn't right here. Am I actually going to get on some sort of communication with this person, which largely should be verbal, and then validate that that person is actually who they say they are? Now, we have technology that would enable us not to have to do that. But some of it is just, I hate to say this. Actually, I don't hate to say this. It comes back to common sense.
So obviously, it's 2025, and we hear AI, and AI has been in our radar for quite a while. Now it looks like that's going to be the future. We're building data centers left and right. How do you think AI has, both defensively and I guess like maliciously, right, changing the cybersecurity landscape?
Sure. Well, first, I think it's important to point out that AI is not new. Right? Predictive analytics, linear algebra, these are not new things. Deep learning, which is just a shit ton of storage that's quickly accessible, is also not new. If we look at the computing systems that we now call AI, I mean, heck, Teradata was founded by a dear family friend of mine, Jerry Modes. He was one of 3 founders of Teradata Corporation in 1979. Right? We've been using predictive analytics machines, Oracle Exadata, Netezza, Teradata, in corporations for decades now. Now, the compute technology has grown exponentially. We used to look at geometric progression: 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 10, 24, 20, 48, and so on. Okay, we can all do that math. It's pretty straightforward. We're looking at exponential computing power increases. All right, the software has gotten much better. And here's a key point. The user interfaces, the input devices, are now in the hands of consumers. And that's pretty badass, right? You can do a lot of really, really neat things with it. And, we could go down another rabbit hole and even say that human beings have now created, another even species at some point, which is a fairly interesting topic. But it is clearly changing the landscape. It is clearly changing the threat vectors in cybersecurity. It's with Gen AI, you can do a reasonably good job of, mimicking even us. You could create, AI Sanjeev, AI Michael. So things are changing pretty quick. And oh, by the way, it's also in the hands of neophytes. Right? People who wouldn't normally have the skills to create some of these things, if they're creative, right? And they've got significant fluid intelligence but lack experience, can create a high degree of chaos.
We have organizations that fight cyber crimes to, we have prominent companies like CrowdStrike. And whenever nowadays people hear about CrowdStrike, normally they would not really think about it too much. But about a year and a half ago or so, we had a little bit of issue with them. As it turns out, it sort of made them more popular because people started to know what this company was about.
Sure.
So CrowdStrike had an issue that resulted in, basically it was a boot loop issue that, almost all the customers, airports, everything got shut down, and it resulted in almost $5.4 billion loss. Can you take us through that? What happened, and how can we avoid that?
Yeah, again, knowing that we're playing to a large audience here, I'll endeavor to not be as techie as I could be on this. And I want to preface these statements by saying, first of all, the people at CrowdStrike are extremely intelligent and well-meaning people, and so are the people at Microsoft. All right. So, one of the easiest things to do in the world is call everybody else stupid. All right. This had nothing to do with that. All right. I'm going to go back to birthdays for a second, why they matter. All right. And the current folks at Microsoft, nothing to do with this. The folks at CrowdStrike had nothing to do with this. You're talking about fundamentally, you got to look at the operating system itself, Windows 11 in this case. All right. The lineage of Windows 11 really dates back to 2 operating systems. IBM's OS/2 operating system, which most people have not even heard of these days, and Windows NT. Right? Largely, Both of those operating systems, which were designed for the Intel 8286 chip at the time, which was the first real multitasking chip in widespread use at the time, were not really designed with TCP/IP, Transport Control Protocol, Internet Protocol, which is what the Internet runs on today, in mind. So as they evolved over time, and we went from local area networks to wide area networks, and then started connecting everything to the Internet, really, I mean, you can argue when Andreessen and, I was involved in the distribution of the Mosaic browser on a lot of platforms on the text-based internet. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was January 23rd, 1993, and I was sitting there with a small group of people, and Mark had just introduced the software, and all of a sudden we're propagating a browser out onto the internet. Microsoft Windows was not designed with that in mind at the time. And we were using Windows 3.11 at the time. Windows 95 had yet to even come out. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because CrowdStrike has to put in what's called a driver into the system, into the operating system level, to kind of fill some of these gaps. They do actually a very good job at it. Well, the driver in and of itself can corrupt the operating system if there's a problem with it. Even a bad keyboard driver theoretically could cause a problem. So we jokingly called it the blue screen of death at the time. Now, it's not of death, all right? It's actually a feature, because what it does is it halts the operating system. And it says, hey, wait a minute. There's a problem. I don't want to corrupt the file system. I'm going to stop right now. So you introduce a driver into the operating system that was never designed for what it's doing today, although Microsoft has done an exceedingly good job, over layers and layers and layers, now decades, getting it working. CrowdStrike's done a very good job at filling these holes. But if you introduce something into that system that causes a problem, and it has this blue screen of salvation, of savior, it shouldn't be called the blue screen of death. We thought we were funny at the time. All right. So it halts the operating system. Now, what do you have to do to get the operating system working again? Well, what you have to do is you have to go down to the command line, right? And you have to turn off all the drivers that may be causing the problem. So think about the complexity here. Right? Now, you're on a Windows machine right now, right? If you get one of those blue screens, you and we could do this in front of the viewers right now and actually demonstrate this. We have to turn off all those drivers. We have to enable two important drivers disconnected from the network, and we have to eliminate all but two. Right, thereabouts. There's more than two, but for brevity, I'll say the display driver and the keyboard driver. Okay, pretty simple, right? And then we go down the command line, and let's say we just want to be quick. We're not going to preserve the driver that's causing a problem. We either rename those drivers, okay, so they're not loaded by the operating system, or we just delete them, okay, and then boom, everything comes up and it's happy again. Well, imagine doing that across millions of virtual machines at the same time. And then introducing the keystroke, the Control-Alt-Delete keystroke, which, by the way, that keystroke dates all the way back to MS-DOS or PC-DOS, 1980. All right. The complexity to do something as simple as I just described, to actually remedy the problem, that's a shit show fast. So there's a lot in here, and something that sounds pretty simple to remedy is not. And by the way, remembering how all this came about is pretty important too, to be able to live in solution.
Do you feel organizations are, especially since you've dealt with a lot of, high-profile tech companies to all these different institutions, do you feel they're all secure with their processes in cybersecurity trainings? Where do they lack? Is it is it more personal trainings that we have to do, which we kind of talked about earlier?
The word secure is an interesting statement. I'm a big fan of the what I call the IWW hat, the I was wrong hat. It's a very cleansing experience to say I was wrong. And people are afraid to do that sometimes. In technology, it's been my experience, and I certainly, when I was younger, had some of my own challenges with this. You're supposed to be the expert in something, and being able to say, "Hey, I was wrong," is challenging. And that's when you mentioned secure. That's a personal security issue. It's deeply laden in the human psyche. And what we have got now, largely across the cybersecurity continuum, is a swath of very, very smart people, but may not have the breadth and depth necessary to understand a lot of this. And not everybody and always. It's everybody and always doesn't hold up. It's kind of like, your spouse saying, "You always do this." Sanjeev, well, I may mostly do that, but not all the time. What you get a lot in technology is a high degree of insecurity around the knowledge, particularly if a non-technical person, let's say their CEO, is coming to them and screaming bloody murder at them. "Why didn't you know this?" Okay, well, that doesn't create a very healthy environment. And it makes somebody who already may be insecure about wearing that "I was wrong" hat even more so. So you've got a knowledge gap that exists. You've got some human psychology there. And then if you do bring somebody into the room who does understand all of this, then the emperor has no clothes. That's a challenge. I'd also laden one other component onto this. And, there are, whatever we focus on, and this is laden in quantum physics, we're going to get more of. Okay, so we have to identify what the problem is, and then we have to focus on solutions. Right? And there's a myriad of solutions out there. It is very, very challenging for a non-technical CEO or whatever the role is, company, to go out and hire someone who is qualified to do these things. It's like this. Let's hypothesize that you and I all of a sudden were put in charge of the Department of Orthopedic Surgery at UCLA, right? And now we have to go out and hire an orthopedic surgeon. Well, we'd probably look at the resume and say, well, looks like it's qualified here, looks like it's qualified here. They can talk to us about fixing an ulna or a radius or a spiral fracture of a femur. Sounds like they know what they're doing. But if we haven't actually done that ourselves, we don't understand it ourselves, boy, is that tough to hire that person. And you say, okay, well, I'll go out and hire somebody who knows how to hire that person. And you can see how this cascades very, very quickly. And so frequently you have organizations that are laden with folks, and again, not everybody and always, but are laden with folks who don't understand it, who hired people who they don't understand it, who then go and communicate with people who don't understand it. And you've created quite the granny knot. Long-winded answer to a short question.
We focused on this, Michael, I think a lot of times already in this conversation, is human element, the error. And our good friend Brett Johnson was on this podcast. He came on and we kind of talked about how you're able to use the human psyche to really pursue it some. And I'll give you a great example. I actually know someone who got a call supposedly from the IRS, asked them to basically send whatever dollar, they were asking for. And she ended up sending that because she went into a panic.
Yeah.
So the human element,
the eye of Sauron coming after someone and ensuing an eye of panic. Imagine that.
Yeah. And obviously the human element is always going to be there, right? So from someone who actually works at a corporation, I know we go to a whole bunch of these trainings. Sometimes we actually, on purpose, the IT departments will send you these malicious emails, basically, like as a test, whether you pass that test or not, right? So, and it seems like the emails are just getting, very close to what it's supposed to look like. It's difficult to kind of differentiate between what's a legitimate email. Do you feel that's the way how this is gonna go out for for a foreseeable future? Like human elements always going to be a part of this? Well,
the human element certainly is going to be a part of it, and we'll transition this over to even quantum computing, because remember, human beings, our mind, it's not a binary computer. It's a pretty shitty binary computer. That's why we use calculators. It is actually a quantum computer. It's the way that neurosynaptic connectivity, neuroplasticity, and all of that piece together. So the human element is profoundly important. And you have to create culture within an organization. So we used to do training. I mean, one of the best cybersecurity experts that I've ever had the honor of working with, a gentleman by the name of Curtis Ellswick. His intellect was way underestimated by a lot of the people over the years he's worked with because of his quiet demeanor and everything else. But he was very, very good at putting together basically training exercises that were phishing attacks within our own organization. And then it was my job to help create a culture which, if someone responded to one of those phishing attacks, they weren't in trouble. It was let's take this as a teaching moment and let people feel comfortable saying, okay, I responded to this phishing attack, and then the mechanisms of how that worked. And that's only going to become more and more important as AI accelerates, as deepfakes accelerate, and so forth. And we can mimic the behavior of that. And this needs to be a routine thing that's done in every organization with an increasing level of sophistication. People should actually get a reward for responding to one of those things rather than a slap on the hand, particularly when it comes from inside of the organization. So you're creating culture that does that. But one other point I'd like to make in technology, and I've seen this for decades now. We like taking something that was old and making it new again and changing the name of it because it makes us sound really, really smart. All right. Sometimes it's just back to the basics. And the person who responded to a fraudulent request, sometimes it's just the individual taking a breath. What is this? We'll walk around the block. I watch people do this all the time. I know one of the topics is going to be TikTok.
Yes.
Think about the Pavlovian response we get to responding to a text message. Oh, I got to respond right now. Well, no, you really don't. You take a breath and how am I going to type this out? Oh, my girlfriend just sent me an aggressive note or, whatever. I've got to respond to this right away. Well, you don't necessarily have to wire the money right away. You just take a breath and think about it.
We talked about SolarWinds. We talked about the Bangladesh bank hack. In your view, what is the most surprising or unusual cyber attack that you've seen in your career?
Well, the one that is most concerning to me was recently, and it was an attack on the U.S. food supply chain. And again, I want to emphasize there were a lot of good and well-meaning people involved, and nobody did anything dumb, and these are very, very smart people. The threat vectors are so extensive. It's no secret. There were shelves on Whole Foods that were empty. What's very concerning to me, as well as the Army Air Force PXs, which our service members rely on so they can afford to feed their families, were attacked as well, and it came through a weak link in the supply chain. The number of components that were hit there were significant, and it was a shot across everybody's bow that we need to be careful because food security is national security. And the fact that the nation's food security had a shot across its bow, particularly across military installations, I think is one of the most extensive cybersecurity breaches, frankly, in history, if you really think about what it hit and then the number of different players that were involved. The distributor who was primarily targeted was not necessarily primary target of this. There were downstream ramifications, upstream ramifications. The whole nine yards. It was highly complex, and the thing is not always the thing.
What are the other industries that you can think of, like all the industries that's out there? I'm an electrical engineer and I work in the utility space. And I know for a fact that if something were to happen to the grid today, which is obviously there's always a chance of that, that's going to be catastrophic for the country. What's your take on that?
What a good question. as I add more birthdays, my filter has diminished. I would like to believe that I've earned the right to have a diminished filter. I'm going to choose my words here carefully so I don't draw an instruction manual for someone on how to do this. But as an electrical engineer, you're aware of what we can inject across power lines. Right. There's code on everything these days. Very few people realize that, as they plug their power adapter into their iPhone or into their Android device, there's a little tiny chip. And that also has software on it as well. Right? So the ability to inject malicious code across, we use all sorts of different terms, viruses, so forth. It's all malicious code. Malicious code that provides some sort of function that is not good across power lines is extensive. So if you're able to get into a power facility, which by the way could also include a data center, because data centers have their own autonomous power facility. I mean, we at Echostar, along with another brilliant man by the name of Jeff McSchooler, built one of the most sophisticated data centers still even to this day in Cheyenne, Wyoming. It had its own power facilities by definition on board there. Several diesel locomotive engines. Well, each one of those diesel locomotive engines has an engine control unit on it. Okay? Each one of those engine control units is a highly sophisticated computer with, likely a small Linux-based operating system on it and code. You get into one of those machines, what can you do? You can spin up the RPMs on the diesel locomotive and render it inoperable. And while those machines may be designed here in the United States, largely they're manufactured either directly or from parts that are made by a country who is, at least at times, adversarial to the United States. So, that's a Pandora's box in and of itself. Mm-hmm. By the way, imminently solvable. We could get up on a whiteboard and I could likely draw out for you how to solve it. There are ways, actually, through some fairly complex means, to actually be all but impenetrable to these attacks too, but it requires a good degree of breadth and depth, and we'll hit on that a little bit later.
Michael, a follow-up question to that is, okay, so obviously there's going to be means of different attacking vectors, basically, for the grid. Would a department like Department of Energy, or who would be, because currently I don't think there's a worldwide organization kind of like Interpol for cybersecurity. I don't think there is. Right? Well, where are we at with, let's say, in prevention of, let's say, the U.S. grid being hacked? How is the government playing its part in stopping that?
Well, first of all, we have to define what the government is. There's different agencies within the government. Sure. And at least in the United States, we've created behemoth organizations. Right? I am a firm believer that less is more. All right? I would rather have a small group of highly compensated individuals. Like if you came to me and said, hey, I've got this really complex problem to solve, I would rather have 5 people that are paid, and I'm just, again, making up numbers for brevity, 5 people that are paid, $100 million a year, rather than 500 people that are paid 1/2 of that, all bumping into each other in the hallway, arguing about stuff that doesn't matter, hyperventilating about stuff that doesn't matter. So when we've created these large bloated organizations, whether in corporations or in governmental entities, it doesn't lend itself well to figuring out solutions. It also is extremely time consuming. So, you asked me the question about, is there any one organization that is responsible for this? No, there really isn't. And, we also have to take a look at, all the way down to the sovereign individual, okay, who's actually taking responsibility for their own actions each and every day. So it starts both, as below and so above.
Do you think cybercrime will ever be won, or will it always be this cat and mouse game forever?
Well, it's certainly a game of cat and mouse and leapfrog. I remember when I was a kid, I learned how to program machine language when I was in my single digits, and people go, "How'd you do that?" Well, it was a puzzle for us. We were breaking copy protection on games at the time. I want to clarify, that was not illegal. And we weren't pirating, Apple IIe games or Commodore 64 games at the time for any profitability. One, it wasn't against the law. And two, we were simply sharing games with our friends, if even at all. But really, we were doing it because it was a puzzle, right? And as the copy protection technology changed, it became a game of cat and mouse. Well, I'll never forget being in my parents' basement at the time, and we'd pretty much figured out how to crack every piece of copy protected software that existed at the time. And there was this one game that come out, and no matter what we did, I was sitting there with a friend of mine at the time. It was 3:00 in the morning. I remember this like it was yesterday. It was 1984. And we simply couldn't crack this copy protection. And I was sitting there with a 5 1/4 inch double-sided, double-density floppy disk, and I was turning around my finger. And I recognized there was a little tiny dot on part of the magnetic media on this. I looked at it and went, holy shit. They burnt a hole in this disk. So I took a blank floppy disk, and I took a little needle, and I scratched it in the same track and same sector that existed on the other disk. I just matched them up. And then we just did a raw copy together. And there was a single line of code that had existed in the copy protection that was simply an if-then-else. Said, if error on this track and sector, then continue, else fail. Super simple, right? But it was a physical component that they had done to the actual media to keep it, to keep the game from being copied. So this is your question about cat and mouse? Oh, for sure. There's always going to be cat and mouse. We got good at this because it was fun. It was a puzzle. Scratch on a disk.
Yeah. As someone who's been in the industry for a long, long time, has traveled and worked with a lot of, multitude of organizations, what keeps you up at night when it comes to cybersecurity?
So, there's a fine line between competence and arrogance, and I'll endeavor not to cross that. Hubris will get you killed, right? It's actually rather humbling. So I would answer this question by saying, really nothing keeps me up at night anymore. I mean, there's a few things that I haven't since I sleep reasonably well. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier. What keeps me up at night is more this human element, this notion that if you're in a certain role, if you're a CISO, that you know everything, there is not a requirement to get better and better every day in every way, to seek out you can argue, and I have a friend in Israel. She is one of the very smartest cybersecurity people in the entire world. I'd out her right now, but she'd kill me, metaphorically speaking, of course, whose thesis is there's really only about 12 of us left who really understand this with a high degree of breadth and depth. And so that number is getting smaller and smaller. So if there's something that is concerning to me, it's that. Okay. And then those people have a responsibility, this one included, to getting these really super smart zillennials, right, up to speed and then what is the methodology to get them up to speed, given the fact that this takes so long, so they can carry the torch on this stuff.
So, Michael, it's no surprise that tech companies do collect data, right?
Yes.
There's a company, or there's an app by the name of TikTok that has collected data on individuals in the U.S. and apparently ByteDance is the company that actually owns the app. What is the issue with how it was collecting data, or are we just kind of overreacting to like one particular app that's not really U.S. based? Or do you really think that the data that they're collecting is going to affect the way how it's going to affect like how it's going to have like, or potentially there might be issues down the road with the way how they're collecting data.
Well, first of all, let's give some credit where credit is due, regardless of whether we like it or not. Okay, this is a principally based statement, not a political one, not a these are good guys, those are bad guys, any of that. We have to recognize that the software in and of itself is much more than just an app. All right, there's an entire architecture behind it that incredible thought has been put into. I would argue it's one of the most impressive pieces of, from enterprise architecture to actually the user level that has ever been developed. A lot of thought went into it, including the human dopamine response to it. It is actually designed to get particularly, well, frankly, anybody. Birthdays don't matter here. All right, drunken grandpa can get a dopamine response out of it just as easily as a 5-year-old human can get a dopamine response out of it. So that, that gives that Pavlovian response. I'm going to check this, I'm going to check this, I'm going to check this. Part of what is interesting about it is not just the technology, but the human psychology that went into developing this platform. And I think it's best referred to as a platform, because if you looked at the back-end systems and the data analytics gathering, which really is AI, it's just incredibly impressive. If we were to all take a field trip today, and again, I'm grossly oversimplifying this, there's lots of details behind this. If we look at the way that the user interface or application level is utilized in the United States versus how it's utilized in China, it's profoundly different. It's profoundly different, right? We went over to Beijing today, and we'd see that those systems, first of all, they have on and off times during the day because they understand the dopamine response because the system was built that way. The content that it's displaying to young Chinese, and again, this is not an exact vignette, but it's get up, do calisthenics, start moving, because we understand that if you want to apply learning to really planting on the human brain, it's super important to move, all right? They do that really, really well, but they're sending a very specific message, right? We're going to get up, we're going to talk about science, math, technology. We're going to pay respect to our parents. We're going to show respect to the great leader, okay? We're going to do all these things, and then it shuts off. That's interesting, isn't it? It stops, right? They understand each one of those handhelds. They understand the demographic of the very individual that's on there, whether it's boy or girl, how old they are. They understand where they are because they're tracking the movements of those devices. Okay, well, interestingly enough, if you compare and contrast that to what's happening in the United States, it's largely junk food for the brain. It's very different, very different. And then, Sanjeev, how are they taking that data and using predictive analytics, which I referred to earlier, which is a lot of what AI is, and predicting how potentially an adversary, and I would like to believe, by the way, that we're not adversarial at some point. I think we're going to get to a point where, everybody takes a deep breath and goes, wait a minute, we're all friends. We're all human beings. Mother Earth is our home, and the rest of this is a bunch of nonsense. We're hyperventilating over stupid shit. Right? So as people such as yourself help that happen, I think that will go away. But right now, this adversarial scenario where an incredibly sophisticated platform is being used for very positive impacts by its overlords in China, as it may be, but is being used for potentially negative consequences in the United States or other Western countries. That really needs to be looked at. And seeing how our younger population would behave in a future state conflict is certainly part of the calculus. Anybody who doesn't recognize that is
so primarily the issue would be basically a predictive analysis on if there were to be, let's say, an escalation of certain situations between the countries, and then they'll probably look at the patterns of how.
Absolutely. Of course. Of course. I mean, TikTok is only one example of this. I mean, if people knew the number of telephone calls that go across unsecured lines, I mean, it is incredibly easy across a VoIP connection to take we're all on VoIP connections now, voice over IP. Incredibly easy to take a telephone call, convert it from voice to text, and then put it into, again, AI machines, predictive analytics machines. When I was at Echostar, Dish Network was one of the best companies in the world at doing predictive analytics to predict customer behavior. Now, although pride is not a virtue, I am very happy to report that its chairman was very good about saying we're going to preserve people's privacy, so that information was anonymized and so forth. There were internal guardrails that were put in, and that's a principally based statement. It was just latent in the company's culture. You can take that information, particularly of youth, and I referenced telephone calls, all right? You can convert voice to text, and we all know how compressible, even if you're not technical, it's very easy to compress large text files into very, very small data files, and then farm that data for predictive analytics and say, okay, well, Jimmy Joe was talking to Susie Q today, and then by having those systems develop patterns, figure out, okay, this may be a weakness, this may be their strength, this may be how they behave in a few years in a potential conflict. That's pretty intense. Now, here's the thing. There are solutions to all this. People start getting paranoid really quick. Oh my God, the earth is falling, the sky is falling. Well, there's a reason why there are readily available tools out there to have voice conversations. Signal is one of them. You want to have a secure voice conversation? Well, boy, that's a great tool to use. And by the way, Signal is the underlying technology that exists in WhatsApp and in Apple's FaceTime audio and video products.
And would that be just the highest level of encryption that we have today, like the AES 256-bit? Is that what it is? Or what does Signal have that, let's say, some of the other apps may not have?
So, Signal is very good at one of the things we're going to talk about is quantum computing. The team at Signal has done an exceedingly good job at it not only making sure that specifically the telephone calls remain secure through both using a level of encryption that stymies binary computers, but also really stymies quantum computers too, because it's shifting that key around regularly. So Signal's an extremely good platform to use, and it's an open source project too. So I can say, well, I may sound like a sales guy for the product. It's a 501c3, so that it's doing some good for the world. And Meredith Whitaker is running that company right now. Is a pretty special individual. She knows a thing or two about a thing or two. Let me tell you.
We briefly talked about this. I want to go into a little bit of quantum computing situation. As of now, we have folks at Google's and IBM's. I believe they're still in the process of trying quantum computing. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but Sundar Pichai at Google has said that maybe in like 5 to 6 years we may have that technology, or something to that effect. Are we there yet, do you think? Or is this going to be a major issue in the cybersecurity world?
First of all, I think it's important that we define, for our listeners, viewers right now, that quantum computing doesn't displace binary computing. I heard it described this way, and I like this analogy. Both are a vehicle. They're going to get you somewhere, all right? A binary computer is a car, and a quantum computer is a boat. All right. So in many ways, they complement each other. So binary computers aren't going away anytime soon. They're going to be with us for a very, very long time, and they help quantum computers do what they do. Quantum computers do things, particularly when it comes to encryption, that if certain things are not done, And again, I referenced Signal earlier. There are also other emerging technologies, embedded software on some pretty sophisticated hardware that have already contemplated post-quantum encryption. So here's great news. All right. We've already developed the technologies to solve the fact that quantum computers can break current existing encryption. So the solution is already there.
Okay. Does Gen AI scare you in any shape or form?
No, it doesn't, because what it does is it tells me people need to start using their brains again. I referenced this earlier. I am getting better and better in every way every day. That's how people need to view themselves. All right. So it's just another puzzle. If, AI Elon Musk is asking me to send him cryptocurrency and I'm not thinking about it, all right, I should probably stop and look at it for a second. And also, people need to understand, too, that they were the creators of this, okay? They've created, what effectively at some point, it's a foregone conclusion, will become a sentient being. So, raise your children well.
Speaking of a system being sentient, all those sci-fi movies from the 70s and the 80s, were they trying to tell us something that you think is going to become a reality? Is it going to be a problem? Like, you've probably seen like that video of robot in China, I believe, try to fight this guy. And that kind of sent alarm bells around the world, basically. Is that going to be a problem, you think?
Well, so now we're diving into both the philosophical and esoteric. As a parent, sometimes you have a child who you raise is bigger and stronger than you, and at some point, just because of biological limitations, probably could kick your ass. If you raise your kid well, they're not going to kick your ass. So, I'm not a doomsday guy at all on this. People talk about, the Terminator movies and so forth. So let's unpack this a little bit. Isaac Asimov said it pretty well. AI is there to serve humans, and AI shall not cause harm to humans. Okay, sounds pretty simple. But what happens if you as a human go try and unplug AI? You've just caused harm to another species, potentially. I think that's part of the real head scratcher here at some juncture. We're also adding input devices to these robots now. Right now, primarily the only thing consumers really have access to is the input device, the keyboard. Now you can talk to chat or Grok, so forth. At Walter Reed Army Medical, when young people were coming back with blown off limbs and everything else, the technology started being developed to connect to the central nervous system. Feel hot, cold. The brain, just by thinking about it, you can play Pong, you can drive a car, right? Well, if you hook that up to Edge AI on a robot, what do you have? Wow, that's pretty cool stuff. It's pretty cool stuff, right? It's going to be stronger, for sure. It's a machine. Is it going to be smarter than the quantum computer that developed it? Because your brain's a quantum computer? Doubt it.
Sam Altman says, don't say thank you on ChatGPT or any of the AI platforms that you're using, because it burns that extra amount of energy on the grid. I try to do it just as a joke. I try to say thank you, because when that system gonna come after me in, like, I don't know, 30 years, and it's gonna remember, probably, right?
Yeah. All due respect to Sam, pleases and thank yous are probably a good idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, pleases and thank yous are a good idea. And I think, part of the challenge there, and this is, I have a lot of respect for Sam. So, He was on via video, but we were both recently at the Vanderbilt Institute for National Security and Emerging Threats here a number of months ago, and the opportunity to speak. I think it's very, very important, and I'm not shilling for one company or another. I'm not in that game. I think you have your truth, Sanjeev. I have my truth. Sam has his truth. Elon has his truth. All right, I'm just going to kind of focus in on an objective truth. I think it is very important to be able to inspect humans, to inspect how these systems, how these hive minds, that's a Mikeism, are actually functioning. And the one thing that I will credit Grok for is that it's open source. So if you want to go in and inspect it, you can. And there are those who would argue, well, the systems are so complex, who possibly could inspect them? Well, I'll go back to Signal, and I am a shill for Signal. All right. Well, it's got a relatively small team of incredibly bright engineers, but there's millions of people around the world who can inspect the code. All right. So being able to look at what these things are doing is good. And I'll go back to what you said. Yeah, I like pleases and thank yous. I think that's a good thing.
We want to talk about the corporate responsibilities, Michael, and this is what I'm talking about. So initially, you were just talking about deepfakes, and deepfakes are going to be a major, major issue in the future, especially when we talk about, elections, and we've already had issues with elections. You're talking about, a lot of misinformation, disinformation, whatever term you want to use. What's a corporate responsibility in mitigating that as far as deepfakes go? What does companies like, like OpenAIs and all these companies, how do they go about countering that? Because this is going to be a major issue in the next, couple of decades for sure.
Sure. Well, that's a complex issue. We lived in an era for several years, and I think everyone woke up to this. And I cannot emphasize this enough. This has nothing to do with politics. This is about principles above personalities. We spent the better part of, several years, I'll leave it at that, where there was a mass censorship engine that had occurred. And now everybody's kicking themselves about it. It doesn't matter what end of the political spectrum you're on. Anybody with two brain cells to rub together is going, that was a bad idea. So what is the corporate responsibility for companies to come in and say, all right, I'm going to censor this or censor that? All right. Well, I am of the opinion that you don't censor anything, unless it crosses that, line to kind of the freedom of speech issue. You don't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. Right now, how does that impact things like AI, right? Gen AI. Well, obviously, there's all sorts of funny memes going around the internet right now. Here's Sanjeev out in the middle of downtown Austin, this beautiful town we're in right now, in a bikini dancing around the street. That's kind of funny. All right. So, I don't think you'd find that insulting.
Yeah.
Right? What have you. I don't know that it is a company's responsibility to turn that off, and I got to give Mark all the credit in the world over at Meta, because he's pulled a lot of those rails off, and it encourages people to use their own discernment.
Just to play a little devil's advocate to that conversation, previously what Meta would do is, at least on Instagram, you had to get verification by submitting your ID. Right?
Yeah.
So that's where now there was a little bit of a chaos in the thoughts of, now you're putting your IDs out there. Like, what is the the companies surveilling you, that topic. But now here's a little bit of a problem I've seen lately, Michael, and I've seen this firsthand. I know for a fact there's an identity of a person that I know this person is not real. You can kind of tell. You can tell this is a fake person. This is not real. Right? But yet, Meta has given this person a verification, like the blue tick.
Right.
And I know for a fact this person's not real. So that has actually changed in the last year.
Yeah.
And Meta's stock also has gone up significantly higher in the last couple of years, right? And I don't think it's a coincidence. So that's where I was talking about the corporate responsibility in managing this.
Yeah, Meta's getting better at it. I think a lot of these companies are. Laden in that question is the sovereignty of the individual. All right, we need to make sure somebody is who they say they are.
Correct.
All right, now there's probably a metaphor in there too. I know you well enough to know you are exactly who you say you are. I am who I say I am, and that means a lot, just more than what's on my ID. Okay, we'll leave it in that. There are ways with the technology that exists, all right, and there are very few people in the world who know how to do this, to make sure that Michael is actually Michael, that Sanjeev is actually Sanjeev. All right, and you referenced something that is of concern to me. All right, that ID and your digital twin should never, ever, ever be stored anywhere except with you. If your digital twin is compromised in any way, we're not talking about identity theft. We're talking about identity replacement. That is a big deal. Right? The good news is that we have the technology today, so all of that information stays resident on your handheld, just like your own personal wallet, but it's way better than your personal wallet. I mean, shit, man. If I lose my wallet, for heaven's sakes. My pilot's license is floating around, my driver's license floating around, my Coast Guard cert's floating around, all of that stuff. That's called a pain in the ass to replace. All right. If I have everything locked away on a secure iPhone, including my digital twin, right, I'm in really, really good shape. Now, it is the company's responsibility. Now, this is not pick on Mark's company today at all. I think they are actually showing some really quick improvements, and I think they'll figure out the solution to this pretty quick, because there are those of us who have this solution, and we're all pretty close. And it's a matter of us talking, actually talking on this stuff. All right, possessing that information, that digital twin, is an error. All right. Only you should be the owner of your digital twin. Period. End of story. It also is a real mess for these companies in the event that they are breached. And, the best way to operate is assume that you are going to be cyber breached. Containing that information becomes a work program for attorneys. And who wants that? I think Shakespeare said something about that. I'll leave that one alone. All right, and attorneys, all due respect to my friends who are lawyers. But also consumer confidence in these entities is going to drop, whether it's Meta, whether it's, I'm not picking on Mark's company, or whether it's a bank. Now, there's also a responsibility to validate that it's not a fake individual, as you said. And there's ways to do that. You can look at the government issued ID. You can then compare the government ID to, deep scan facial recognition, which, by the way, done correctly, is actually impossible to deepfake. Can't do it because we're three-dimensional objects. If you can hold up a picture, two-dimensional picture to facial ID, then guess what? You're doing it wrong. All right, not you as an individual, Sanjeev, but the way that system was put together was done incorrectly. So that there are solutions to this, but I love the vignette that you pointed out. That probably shouldn't exist, and my guess is after this conversation, they'll fix that pretty quick.
Let's hope so. I hope so.
They're pretty smart.
Question on the free speech now. I know obviously we've had a very tough last week with obviously murder of Charlie Kirk, and you may agree with the guy, you may not agree with the guy, but obviously free speech is something that's given by the Constitution. But when you apply that to, let's say, a platform like, previously we had a lot of censorship through X or Twitter before. An argument always comes on the table, Michael, about, okay, free speech exists, right? But also you're sort of putting that out there on a platform of a company. Now, does that company just owning that platform sort of like you're adhering to their set of rules that not necessarily give you the right to free speech? Or is that's where like always there's this back and forth, right? So how do we go about that?
Well, first of all, I I mean, you mentioned Charlie and his family, and I'd like to just, pause for a moment. What happened this last week is unspeakably disgusting. I don't give a flying fuck if you agree with Charlie or not. And I would be saying exactly the same thing that I am saying now if it was someone on a different end of the political spectrum. This is a man who was engaging people in dialogue. All right. And it could have been someone with a Marxist ideology up there, and I would be saying exactly the same thing right now. And the fact that this man was murdered because of political vitriol, and now you see people, posting on X, posting on Instagram, saying basically he got what he deserved and so forth. I mean, is absolutely reprehensible. People should look at the core principles of this, Sanjeev, and saying this is a man who was encouraging dialogue. He was having debate with people. My college economics professor, was at Bard was a Marxist. I certainly didn't agree with everything he said, but I loved studying with him because he was constantly getting my goat. What about this?
Sure.
What about that? What about this? What about that? He was actually doing the same thing that Charlie was doing.
Yeah.
All right. At the same time. I couldn't imagine anybody in their right mind taking a shot at him. And the fact that there are people today after this has happened, who quietly are saying, he got what he deserved. I mean, they should really take a look at themselves. All right. Now that I've said my piece on that topic, and I think, everybody would be, however they view things, should give pause, take a look at themselves, whatever, whether it's God or the universe or the quantum field, should actually really take a hard look at themselves after what happened. And I believe this all happened for us, not to us, so we can become a better people together all around the world. Okay, so that's my soapbox on that topic. Now, when we're talking about utilizing these platforms, obviously they're owned by, when I say private company, I'm using that loosely, right? They're publicly held corporations. I mean, certainly under contract law, and, this is going to be the inner unlicensed lawyer in me talking now. Their terms of use give them the right, shall we say, to limit the use of their platforms. Of course, Elon has made it abundantly clear that he is an unapologetic supporter of freedom of speech. And, provided something doesn't break a law in country, he's going to allow that to happen. Mark has gone very much the same direction with Instagram. I happen to believe that that's a really, really good idea. All right. Now, sometimes it can ensue vitriol. But provided, there are some, and I say this loosely, guardrails on stuff. It's the analogy to yelling fire in a crowded movie theater. I think freedom of speech is a very good idea because it keeps the dialogue going. But people need to return to civility too.
Yeah, basically. I mean, I could not agree with you more on, whether you agreed with the guy or not. And I told you this also, Michael, before that. There's a lot of debates that I think he won, but also there's a lot of debates that he lost.
Right.
And that's the whole premise of this, is having this dialogue and conversations where you have to be open-minded to be wrong. That's right. What it is. You have. That's right. Because not everyone's always right.
Look at this famous hat. All right. These are some of the most impactful people in the world have signed this hat. You know what that stands for? IWW. I was wrong.
There you go.
I was wrong.
There you go. And
right?
we will be wrong.
If we looked at the people who signed this, it gives everyone pause, because it's a very cleansing experience to sit back and say, hey, I was wrong.
Yeah. And oftentimes you will be wrong because you're not going to know everything, right? So anyways, going back to this, Michael, so I did take a few questions from the audience, and I was able to just kind of bring it up. There's a few more trickling here. Okay. So basically, I think we may have covered this before as well. How is AI changing the way we detect and respond to AI-generated cyber threats?
Well, we're using AI to combat AI now.
Okay, that's interesting, right? And additional to that point, I'll give you a very silly example, right? A college kid today will go out there and use a platform to write an essay, like using AI. And the teacher uses AI to detect whether it's a legitimate use of, or someone actually did write that paper, or it was AI generated. Now we have this clash of AIs. Who's going to win? What are we talking about here?
Oh, so, I do some adjunct work at now one school when I'm invited in to pontificate every once in a while. The educational system needs to get over people, regardless of birthdays, old, young, in between, using AI to generate stuff, because you still have to know how to prompt it, right? It's the old saying, garbage in, garbage out. We talk about papers or even coding. Like, if you don't understand the layers of abstraction that I keep mentioning, all you're going to do is produce shitty code. I know developers been around for a long time who can basically write, a prompt that is pretty significant. It may take them 20 minutes to write that prompt, but then it'll sync. It's the same thing with the paper, right? AI may have generated it, but boy, if you prompt it with all the things, you're actually demonstrating knowledge as such. Now, when it pertains to the cybersecurity landscape, you do have folks who are able to prompt these systems fairly well to initiate all sorts of interesting cyber attacks, ransomware attacks, phishing attacks, and all of that. And then using AI to detect it, that's a little challenging. And I will throw this one out for you, Sanjeev. AI systems are running primarily on binary computing technology right now. At some point, there will be a convergence of binary computing and quantum computing running the AI systems. Right? Well, that's a bit of a game changer, because remember, your brain is a quantum computer. By definition, it's a quantum computer. Right. So that's going to get real interesting. Right now, if human beings just take a pause, they would find that they're way more powerful than they think they are. Most humans with a pretty good level of fluid intelligence, because their brain is a quantum computer, can figure most of this stuff out without a whole lot of help.
Next question on this. So we had Salesforce CEO claiming that perhaps AI will handle 30 to 50% of the internal work at Salesforce. That's a point. And then the second thing I want to add to that is I actually have a lot of friends who are software developers, and what they've told me is, they've learned how to code all these years, and now when they're about to go to, they're working their day jobs, it's very tempting for them even to use an automatic code generator than, just waste like 6 hours trying to just write up a code where a system just generates a code in no time, right? Do you think that that'll be a common for all companies in the future? What does that mean for individuals? What does that mean for jobs?
Well, both and, so this CEO of Salesforce is correct, and your friends are correct, all right? This is a tool that can be used, but you have to know how to use the tool, all right? Susie Q, Jimmy Joe on the street, who's never done coding before, is simply going to prompt engineer garbage into the system, and that's exactly what they're going to get out. Garbage in, garbage out. Now, the software developers who are going to survive are the ones who understand the complexity of enterprise architecture, layers of abstraction that we keep bringing up, and will be able to train these systems to know it. The ones who are in trouble are the ones who are just coming in right now. Now, they're not as in much trouble as the legal profession is, right? So, new attorneys who are just entering the workforce right now are effectively obsolete before they even come in. The ones who are not, and by the way, this is directly analogous to software developers. It's fancy language for computer programmer, okay? It's the attorneys who are extremely valuable right now are the ones who understand constitutional law, statutory law, case law, know how to read a document, for correctness, but know how to prompt the system. So they can prompt the system. And by the way, there is a Goldilocks age in here too, and I'm not meaning to be ageist, but those who are kind of in their mid-50s or so, that kind of Gen X, so they've had even enough time to practice and they have some breadth and depth, they can go in and prompt engineer one of these systems. And again, this is directly analogous to a high-end computer programmer, right? They can go in and prompt these systems and they render the people beneath them obsolete because of what your friend said, okay? They don't need to spend 6 hours on that. They can literally do it with correct language populated into the system in, call it maybe 5 or 7 minutes time, and then spend maybe 17 minutes reviewing the document. But if you don't understand how to prompt the system and then you don't understand its output, you still have to review the code. So your friend who generated that in a few minutes, well, he's still going to have to put his big brain on that to review that code. If he doesn't review that code, not picking on him, but he's either not competent or worse, he's negligent because he's the one who generated it. He's the one who prompted its generation, I should say. So is there a need? Oh yeah, there's still a need, but it's the need for the really, really high-end folks, which is also why you're seeing this in cybersecurity space. And in the AI space, we're now seeing top talent traded the same way an NFL quarterback would be traded. There's a reason for that. And oh, by the way, it's kind of eliminated this need for employment conflict and everything else, because if Microsoft wants to go trade, for the Bo Nix of cybersecurity, there's not a whole lot of argument about it. They just swap the contracts. But those are the people who are going to do real well over a number of years. And one other point I would make too is to all those electricians and all those plumbers out there, boy, they just became super valuable because we're going to need a lot of those people.
Absolutely.
So all those folks who stuck their nose up in the air, remember, plumbers have saved more lives over the centuries than any medical doctor ever has. All right. Those people just got super valuable because we need to liquid cool these data centers, and you better know how to string cable, and that requires your hands and your brain and your eyes and everything else. So big shout out to those plumbers and electricians. God bless them.
Question from the audience. So will there ever be a day where we'll be without the zero-day attacks or vulnerabilities, or are they always going to exist and we will have to counter them?
There's always going to be a day where zero-day attacks occur. Zero-day attacks are kind of the holy grail of how to get in, how to get into these systems. There are, oh boy. This goes to the complexity of how to insulate enterprise systems to thwart those types of things. There is something called genetic diversity in systems. I'll just give you a brief vignette here. You have 2 intrusion detection and stateful inspection devices. When I say device, and there's a lot to that, right? It's hardware, it's software, it's everything. It's inspecting every packet that goes across the line. Both systems do the same thing. They're designed to do the same thing. However, they come from different parts of the world. Maybe one comes from Silicon Valley or, Boulder, Colorado, or Tel Aviv. Both do the same thing, but the humans who design them think differently. So they may do the same thing, but they do it in a very, very different way. Right? When you can configure, which goes back to what we were talking about earlier, you have to understand systems administration. You have to understand networking. You have to understand computer programming, all of these different elements that come into play. If you're able to configure 2 completely diverse systems that are designed to do the same thing to thwart some of these attacks, that's one of several. There's not just one holy grail. One of several holy grails of cybersecurity. Now, here's the rub with that. You better know what you're doing, because if you don't configure those systems correctly, guess what they're going to do? They're actually going to shut your entire enterprise off. And if you've got an enterprise that's complex, as a large telecommunications company, such as one that I used to work with, or a car company, or an aircraft manufacturer, or even a food supply company, a grocery store, for instance, and you don't configure those systems correctly, and you don't have the people on board who know how to configure those systems correctly, well, cybersecurity attacks only have your problem because you just shut the business down. Right? Requires a lot.
Okay. Another question for you, Michael. Windows versus Mac. Which one's better? Either or?
Well, I'm probably not going to make a whole lot of friends here on this one, or I may make some friends. All right. So I am not a shill for either company. Let me point this out. All right. We have to look at what the operating systems are first. All right. So fundamentally, Microsoft, and I can't say enough good things about them. I mean, they've got an incredibly brilliant CEO as an engineer himself. I'm going to take a quick sidebar here. The landscape has changed across pretty much everything these days. I don't care if you run a bank, or you run a car company, or you run a grocery store. Every CEO today needs to be a tech CEO. They used to think that was the tail wagging the dog. Well, it's not anymore. All right. I have a very good friend of mine who runs one of the largest banks in the world, and he's relatively young. He's looking for his replacement right now. And when I had lunch with him about a year ago, I said, I looked at him and I said, "Why are you?" I got to be careful not to mention his name, or he's going to kill me. Why are you stepping down? I said, "You're running one of the most successful banks in the world right now. You guys are at the leading edge, the whole 9 yards." He said, "I'm past my shoelaces." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, I got behind all this stuff. To run a company like this, you have to be a tech CEO, because you don't know who to hire if you're not. So, that's one of the fundamental conundrums. So I just take that sidebar here for a second. So the question was, a Mac OS or a Windows OS. So, in the case of what Microsoft has done, that they've done a very good job of, is they took an operating system that was not fundamentally designed back in the mid-1980s, based on OS2 and Windows NT. So mid-late 1980s is when those code lines really had begun in earnest. So call it 86 and on. Into the mid-1990s, was not contemplated with transport control protocol, internet protocol in mind. We talked about this a little bit earlier as it pertained to CrowdStrike. Apple made some decisions to adopt a Unix-based operating system, fundamentally BSD Unix, quite some time ago. The entire internet runs on Unix. Right. So it's dealing with a foundation of the house that, by its very design, was built from the ground up years ago, before the internet was ever graphical. All right, to basically power the internet. So there are some advantages that operating system has, both in cybersecurity, in functionality to the internet, and so forth. Now, of course, Microsoft has an advantage because of market penetration and how much larger, their footprint is around the world. But from a cyber standpoint, there are significant advantages that a Unix-based operating system has, whether it's Linux, whether it's Mac OS, and so forth. So I would certainly give Apple the edge there. Significant edge.
Okay. So Michael, audience may know or may not know that you're also into flying a little bit, right?
A little bit.
Okay, this is a very interesting question that certainly gets Joe Rogan interested all the time, about the UFOs. Do you think that there are extraterrestrial activities in the world that's legitimate, or do you think it's just foreign technology that we just don't know what it is? You have these, flying saucers, if you call them, that don't have any heat signatures, no heat traces, and and this is something that's verified by a lot of the folks that have flown with the U.S. Air Force, right?
Sure.
So, thoughts?
Well, it's a great question. So, this is where I would really like to see human beings stop hyperventilating about shit that doesn't matter. Whether it's, old men falling off of stages and, bombastic New York City real estate behavior. But by the way, both of those men care very much about this country, so I'll leave it at that. But let's stop hyperventilating about stuff that doesn't matter and focus on the real important things of humanity and human evolution. So it's a great question. It's important while people were hyperventilating about shit that doesn't matter, to understand that within the last couple of years, by definition, human beings just became an interstellar species. All right, first of all, Voyager left the solar system. Voyager was launched in the late 1970s. A little tiny computer on it. It's putting off just enough power to still send back signals that we thought were junk signals. But quantum computing is able to interpret some of those signals that a binary computer thought was junk. Right? And there's messages in a bottle. What those are yet? Not quite sure. Also, the Google lab did this. It's right in plain sight. I mean, people can go out and research this. I mean, transversable wormholes. And human beings are on the precipice of great things. And when we look at, E.T. or whatever you want to call it, of course we have friends out there. Of course we have friends. I mean, should we be so arrogant as to think that we don't? I mean, there's trillions to an exponent of trillions of other planets out there. Now, how many of them support life? It's a finite number. Look at our own solar system. But the James Webb Telescope is exposing this. Heck, when you and I were in school, we only thought there were a handful of planets because we couldn't prove there were others. Well, Hubble kind of put a pin in that. Hubble's pretty basic technology based on where we are now. Well, what James Webb is bringing back is pretty intense. So we became an interstellar species by definition. Kind of understand how transversable wormholes work. And, we're mastering quantum physics at this point. I think it's pretty safe to say that we got a whole bunch of friends out there, but it's also pretty safe to say, we should behave ourselves, if we want to make friends. I don't view it any differently than, when various societies, whether you can argue the Chinese hit the West Coast first or Europeans hit the East Coast first. I'm not going to get into the who got here first argument, but, it's a pretty big neighborhood out there, just expanding our horizons.
Sure.
So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. Yeah. I mean, so you do believe that there's stuff out there.
We got friends all over the place.
Probably. Yeah. I mean, it's expanding the galaxy is, and let's go back to like this last question that's coming your way. So let's say if you have the magic wand, as an expert in the cybersecurity world, if you are running an organization, what would you do to ensure like your organization was secure?
Well, I have to be, and I'm not one to be coy. All right, I'm a little protective on method and means today. All right. The 30,000-foot answer to that question is I would be consistently inconsistent. All right. I know that sounds like an oxymoron. All right. But I wouldn't be employing traditional means with anything and everything. Because if you've got one homogeneous system, heterogeneous systems and homogeneous systems. All right, the threat vectors across that can eventually be exploited. I would also be compartmentalizing information. Any information that I did have that was valuable, I would make sure was encrypted. So if it was compromised, what do you have? You don't have shit if it is. And I certainly would not be possessing information. I mean, the large cloud providers, there is a and again, I'm not picking on, Azure or AWS or anybody else for that matter. Have to a large degree, in my estimation, have a certain level of complacency as to the data that they hold. Holding that data is not in anybody's best interest. Large corporations hold this information because they think they may be able to monetize it. I alluded to this earlier. In the event of a cybersecurity breach, any monetization that they can get over that data is going to be trivialized based on the litigation or work program for attorneys, as I call it, or the lack of consumer confidence. The zillennials are just they're gonna vote with their feet and say, "Screw you! I don't trust you anymore." The other thing is, people need to hire extremely well. Smaller teams of super smart people. Doesn't matter if they graduated from the 6th grade. All right. I don't care where they went to school. If they've been doing it for a while, they can demonstrate that knowledge, right? And they can put in highly complex systems that involve genetic diversity, understand how to protect method and means, and do understand that it is a game of cat and mouse, and it's a passion of theirs. Through all of these different processes, both human and technical, it is actually possible to make an organization impervious to an attack. We always say cybersecurity attacks, and I generally say this too. Cybersecurity attacks are inevitable. Well, they're inevitable because people don't know how to do the kind of stuff that we're talking about right now, Sanjeev.
Last one, just actually trickled in. Sorry, I keep on saying last question.
No, that's all right. It's
keep
fun.
on coming. Okay. Are you a crypto dude? Are you a pro crypto, or are you against it? What's your thought in that? And how it's kind of related to the cybersecurity world also is the Colonial Pipeline, which was one of the hacks that had happened a few years back. I guess they had installed obviously malware, but they also demanded payment in Bitcoin, and I think there was a portion of the Bitcoins was recovered, but still you have that element of uses for those kind of activities, right? So, anyways, are you for crypto? Or are you against it? Your thought, your take.
So, first of all, I'm very pro crypto. It has to be the right kind of crypto, though.
What do you mean? Right?
Well, everybody gets hyped up and they join the bandwagon. A few years ago, everybody's running around selling pictures of monkeys on the internet.
The NFTs you're talking about?
Yeah. God, you're doing it wrong. Stop doing that. Or crypto that isn't backed by anything. And, a bunch of it. By the way, the term neophyte is actually a compliment. All right. People say, you're a neophyte. Well, that's a compliment. It means you have the capability of learning. I mean, these weren't neophytes who were getting involved in cryptocurrency. They were out selling, Mickey Mouse, or trash can cryptocurrency effectively. But if we just hone in on one specific type of currency, just because it's easiest for brevity, Bitcoin is remarkable. All right. You've got some, and this is the economist in me, and I do resemble one of those. You can't quantitatively ease it. All right. That is pretty cool. All right. We have gotten in the habit of this country, and you look at since we moved off of the gold standard a number of years ago, what inflation has done. And, every society needs a thriving middle class. Inflation has done a number on folks in this country. We can, argue back and forth about the necessity or lack of necessity for the Federal Reserve, any of this kind of stuff. But the fact that we can just print money at a whim, and the United States is an incredibly large economy. If you look at the masters of quantitative easing, all right, those really were the Swiss, but it's a relatively small country with a whole bunch of, super, super duper smart people. Bitcoin in particular thwarts this ability. It also enables people to be sovereign over themselves. Listen, man, it's your money. All right. You should be able to do with your money whatever you want to do with your money without having the Eye of Sauron come after you or anybody else. All right. And as we look at crypto technologies, and this actually relates directly back to cybersecurity, all right, these cloud exchanges to me are a little odd, because if the whole idea of cryptocurrency is, okay, one, it can't be quantitatively eased, it can help people all around the world, it is a universally translatable form of currency, it's now relatively easy to use. Well, heck, with a hardware key, you're your own bank, right? Now, there are very, very powerful interests who are not interested in having that happen. Big banks. I hear this all the time. And again, I'm not taking a shot at any of the big banks. It's just, if you go out and you talk to who your actual consumers are, and I've referenced it, at least 6 times during this conversation, these younger millennials and older Gen Zers, kind of call it 23-ish, give or take, to, early 30s. They walk into a branch of a big bank. They go, Sanjeev, what am I paying for? What is all of this stuff? I don't need any of this. And I can just go click, click. And then I've got a currency that I know isn't going to be impacted by a bunch of people who I don't know and I don't particularly understand and I don't particularly resonate with, who just print $100 bills anytime they think it's necessary to do that. So yeah, I think.
So in a nutshell, you're pro crypto guy.
Yeah, I think that's the short answer. But it's got to be the right kind of crypto. And then people also have to understand what they're doing. Because here's the one thing that the banks do offer. Okay, they offer security. Okay, whether that's real or it's a perception. You do some of the things I just alluded to, and you lose your phone, you lose your hardware key, and you lose your password, and you lose everything else. Kind of like losing your wallet with a bunch of cash in it. You've got, whether it's a couple thousand or a couple million in that, you're on your own. Now, I'm a huge fan of that, and I'll tell you why, because I'm all about the sovereignty of the individual and personal responsibility. If I lose my wallet with my pilot's license in it today, okay, I lost my wallet, that's on me. All right, I can go blaming somebody else. But if you want that additional level of security and you want the oversight, you should have the freedom of choice. If you want to walk into one of the big banks and bank with them, I'm not taking anything away from you. Go do that. And you want the security of some of the things that the government puts in place, go do it. But you should have the choice and understand both.
Okay. The questions keep on trickling in. I apologize. I got one more. This is for the pilot in you. I know we're kind of bouncing back between crypto and all these different topics, but for someone who regularly flies and is an expert at that. Primarily in the world, there are 2 companies that own the airspace. You have Airbus, Boeing. And prior to Boeing merging with, MD all those years ago, like
Douglas, yes.
There's a lot of cultural shift that came across that, that made a lot of changes at Boeing, right? As someone who's seen that particular space, do you think that right now Boeing's doing okay, they could do better? Or do you think that there's issues, there's a lot of issues that should be remedied in some sense?
Mm-hmm.
I know this kind of came out of nowhere, but.
No, it's a great question. And it's a question I appreciate, and I actually get asked frequently. It gives me pause for a second. Boeing is one of the best companies that has ever existed, at least in this incarnation of human beings, ever. To watch their fall outside of the defense industry, all right, in commercial aircraft has been palpable. I never thought I'd see the day when primarily the French, and of course my last name is French, so my fellow Frenchmen don't take this personally. We're making a better aircraft than Boeing was. I never thought I'd see that day. All right, but it is a lesson for folks. All right, when you're an engineering company, it needs to be run by engineers. All right, you don't move your engineers away from where you're making the airplanes. All right, when you make something that is good, all right, and you make the best thing, all right, with the best people are going to buy it, particularly if you make it at the best price. And by the way, you can actually do all those things. You can make it at a really good price. You can make the best thing. You can have leadership who knows how it's put together. When you start looking at things in that, it was almost a reverse acquisition, you could say, when McDonnell Douglas came in the door. And, of course, there's brilliant people in St. Louis, right? There's no doubt about it. I mean, it's a pride of that city, right? Came in and all of a sudden, we're looking at nickels and dimes to try and do things with aircraft. And, what was done with the 737 MAX, I've been fairly outspoken about. Designing an aircraft in that capacity. Now, We have to take a look at both of these companies too. Very few people go out to their websites. Their commercial aircraft business, probably not as important to them as their ties to the military-industrial defense complex. Right? These companies make significant amounts of weapons of war, and having had a lot of exposure to my friends and family, who've been shot at and everything else. I would rather see us not seeing a whole bunch of young men and women die in wars all over the place. And both of those manufacturers have vested interests in making sure that wars around the world continue. And I would like to see that stop. I'd like to see them, instead of investing so much money in things that kill people, things that progress humanity's connection to each other. Hypersonic aircraft. Think about all the money that we've dumped into senseless wars that could have been funneled into making commercial aircraft that could go from New York to Tokyo in a matter of hours and connecting the world in ways that have never been done before. Instead we're making commercial aircraft by today's standards are absolutely primitive, but we're funneling money into all of this other nonsense. So, Airbus is doing a pretty good job on commercial aircraft, but all of them are, not where they should be, in my opinion.
Okay. Well, I know we briefly talked about this. You were born in Colorado?
Yes.
So I told you, obviously, Michael, by this time, that I originally grew up in Nepal, being like almost 20 years. And just wanted to give this shout out to like the Gen Zers. I think we briefly talked about this like last week also. They managed to pull something off in Nepal.
Yes.
That has happened like, decades. And it's, again, shout out to those guys. They've done a fantastic job of what they could do. And
our fellow Sherpas.
There you go. I know you call yourself like an honorary Sherpa because obviously you were able to like take in a lot of airs in your lung, but again, I just wanted to kind of give a shout out. Have you had a thought of going to Nepal anytime soon?
Yeah, I actually hope to be over there relatively soon, actually. Okay. So I spent a lot of time in that part of the world. And what they did took to courage, principles, or personalities. Some of them gave their lives. I think it was 19 of them.
Yeah. I think that they're actually more. There's just the numbers counts going up, but
gave their lives, but they did it quickly. And for those who did, nothing ever happens to us. Everything happens for us. And they took a stand on some very principled issues. And people sometimes confuse principles with politics, and they took a principled view of things, and great things are gonna happen.
Yeah.
So
very optimistic.
I am too.
Michael, thank you for doing this.
Thank you very much for having me. That was great. Appreciate you.
Thanks. Namaste.